In the early days of the Pacific War, the sky belonged to Japan. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a masterpiece of engineering. It was light as a feather. It was agile as a swallow. It could turn circles around anything the Allies could put in the air. American pilots in their stubby Wildcats were dying in droves. They tried to dogfight the Zero, and they lost. They tried to climb away from the Zero, and they lost. The Japanese pilots felt invincible. They were the samurai of the modern age. They believed their spirit was superior to American steel. They looked at the clumsy American tactics with disdain. They mocked the heavy, armored planes of the U.S. Navy. The Americans fly like bricks, they joked in their mess halls. They believed that maneuverability was the only thing that mattered. They stripped armor off their own planes to make them lighter. They removed self-sealing fuel tanks to gain range. They sacrificed protection for performance. It was a philosophy born of arrogance. They thought the war would always be a duel. They thought the enemy would always play by their rules. They owned the air over the Philippines. They owned the air over the Dutch East Indies. They owned the air over New Guinea. Everywhere they flew, the Allied air forces crumbled. The Zero pilot would pull back on his stick. The plane would loop effortlessly. He would drop in behind the American plane. A short burst of 20mm cannon fire. The American plane would burn. It was too easy. The Japanese believed they had solved the riddle of aerial combat. They didn't know that the riddle was about to change. They didn't know that in a factory in Connecticut, a monster was being born. A monster that didn't care about dancing. A monster that only cared about speed. The Vought F4U Corsair was not built like a normal plane. It was built around an engine. The designers took the biggest engine available in 1938. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It had 18 cylinders. It produced 2,000 horsepower. It was an engine designed for a bomber, not a fighter. But they stuffed it into a fighter anyway. To harness that power, they needed a propeller. It was a massive, three-bladed Hamilton standard prop. It was over 13 feet wide. This created a massive engineering problem. If the wings were straight, the propeller would hit the ground. They needed longer landing gear. But long landing gear is weak. It snaps on a carrier deck. So the designers did something radical. They bent the wings. They created an inverted gull wing. The wings dipped down from the fuselage. Then they angled back up. This put the landing gear at the lowest point. It allowed the gear to be short and strong. And it kept the massive propeller off the runway. The result was the most distinctive silhouette of the war. It looked like a shark. It looked aggressive. It looked heavy. And it was heavy. It weighed nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded. That was twice the weight of a Zero. Japanese spies saw the early drawings. They laughed. It is too big, they said. It is too complex, they said. It will never turn. They were right about the turning. But they were wrong about the threat. They were looking at a plane designed for a knife fight. The Americans were building a plane for a drag race. And this dragster had guns. Before the Corsair could fight the Japanese, It had to fight the US Navy. The Navy hated it. It was a nightmare to fly. The nose was incredibly long. It stretched out 14 feet in front of the cockpit. When the plane was on the ground, the nose pointed up. The pilot couldn't see anything in front of him. He was blind. To taxi, he had to S-turn back and forth. Landing was even worse. On a carrier approach, the long nose blocked the view of the deck. The pilot lost sight of the landing signal officer at the crucial moment. He had to guess. And then there was the bounce. The landing gear struts were too stiff. They were filled with high-pressure oil. When the Corsair hit the deck, it didn't stick. It leaped back into the air. It would bounce over the arrestor wires. It would crash into the safety barrier. Or it would flip over on its back. Young pilots were terrified of it. They called it the ensign eliminator. They called it the bent-wing widowmaker. Hydraulic fluid leaked from the cowl flaps. It smeared across the windshield. The pilot was blind on the outside and blind on the inside. The Navy declared the plane unfit for carrier duty. It was a failure. They chose the easier, safer Hellcat instead. The Corsair was banished. It seemed like the Japanese were right. The American technology was too clumsy. The monster was too hard to tame. But the plane was too fast to scrap. So the Navy dumped it on the Marines. The Marines didn't have carriers. They had dirt strips on islands. They didn't care about the bounce. They just wanted to kill Zeros. The first Corsairs arrived at Guadalcanal in early 1943. The airfield was a mudhole. It was called Henderson Field. The Marines there were living in squalor. They were fighting malaria and dysentery. They were flying tired, battered Wildcats. Then that Rejects arrived. VMF 124 was the first squadron. The pilots looked at their new machines. They were huge. They towered over the little Wildcats. The mechanics cursed the complex hydraulic systems. But then they started the engines. The ground shook. The roar of the US-2800 was deafening. It wasn't a whine, it was a growl. The pilots took them up for the first time. They felt the power. They pushed the throttle forward. The G-force pinned them to the seat. It climbed like a rocket. It was 50 miles per hour faster than a Zero. The Marines realized they had a weapon. It wasn't a dogfighter. It was a sniper rifle. They learned to handle the blind taxiing. They learned to be gentle on the landing. They took the failed plane and made it their own. The Japanese pilots at Rabaul saw the new shapes. They saw the bent wings. They thought it was just another heavy American target. They flew out to meet them. They expected the Americans to turn and fight. But the Marines didn't turn. They dove. They came down from the sun at 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilots looked up. They didn't know it yet, but the playground was closed. The monster had arrived. The Corsair had a weapon that wasn't a gun. It was a sound. Japanese soldiers on the ground learned to fear it. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It was a high-pitched shriek. They called it Wikio K's. Whistling death. The sound was an accident of design. The massive R2800 engine needed air. Lots of air. The designers put the oil coolers and air intakes in the wing roots, right next to the fuselage. When the Corsair dove, the air rushed over these intakes. It moved at 400 miles per hour. The turbulence created a harmonic resonance. It sounded like a banshee screaming. To a Japanese soldier in a foxhole, it was terrifying. It started as a low moan. It rose quickly to a piercing scream. It meant a plane was coming down. And it was coming fast. The Zero was quiet. The Zero was graceful. The Corsair was loud. The Corsair was a brute. It screamed as it killed. Psychologically, it was devastating. Japanese pilots began to associate the whistle with death. They knew that sound meant they were being hunted. It meant a heavy American plane was diving on them. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Americans loved the name. They embraced it. It added to the legend of the plane. The Reject. The Marine Plane. The Whistling Death. It was the soundtrack of the American counterattack. The elegant dance of 1942 was over. The screaming slaughter of 1943 had begun. The air over the Solomons was filled with the noise. And the Japanese Empire was listening to its own doom. The Corsair was an unconventional plane. It found its greatest fame with an unconventional unit. VMF 214. The Black Sheep. Their leader was Major Gregory Papier Boyington. He was a drinker. He was a brawler. He was a rebel. He had flown with the Flying Tigers in China. He knew how to kill Japanese planes. The Marine Corps had almost kicked him out. But they needed leaders. They gave him a squadron of misfits. These were replacement pilots. Leftovers who hadn't been assigned to other units. They had no planes of their own. They had to borrow Corsairs from other squadrons. They were the black sheep of the Marine Corps. But Boyington turned them into legends. He understood the Corsair perfectly. He knew it wasn't a dogfighter. He taught his pilots to fight as a team. He taught them the thatch weave. If a Zero got on a Corsair's tail, another Corsair would cross behind it. This forced the Zero to break off or face a head-on pass. Boyington was aggressive. He used the Corsair's range to go deep. He attacked Japanese airfields that were supposed to be safe. He taunted the Japanese over the radio. He challenged them to come up and fight. The Japanese pilots were enraged. They took off to silence him. But the black sheep were waiting. They were high above, ready to dive. VMF 214 racked up incredible scores. In just 84 days, they destroyed or damaged 203 Japanese planes. Boyington became the top Marine ace. He proved that the Corsair was a winner. It wasn't just a powerful machine. It was a weapon for rebels. The pirates of the Solomons flew the bent-wing bird. The battle between the Corsair and the Zero was a clash of physics. It was energy fighting versus angles fighting. The Zero was an angles fighter. It was light. It had a large wing area. It could turn inside a phone booth. It won fights by creating angles. It got inside the enemy's turn radius. The Corsair was an energy fighter. It was heavy, but it had massive horsepower. Energy comes in two forms: speed and altitude. A pilot can trade one for the other. You dive to gain speed. You zoom up to gain altitude. The Corsair's advantage was energy retention. It could generate energy with its engine. It could keep energy with its weight. A Zero pilot tried to lure the Corsair into a turn. He wanted a slow, twisting fight. The Corsair pilot refused. He kept his speed up. He never turned for more than a few seconds. He would dive on a Zero. He would fire. And then he would zoom back up. The Zero pilot would try to follow. But the Zero was light. It had no momentum. It ran out of energy quickly. It would stall. It would hang helplessly in the air. The Corsair pilot would wing over. He would drop back down for the kill. It was a clinical way of fighting. It was mathematical. The Japanese pilots found it frustrating. They thought it was dishonorable. They felt the Americans were running away. But the Americans weren't running away. They were resetting. They were using their 2,000 horsepower to dictate the fight. The Japanese pilot was always reacting. The American pilot was always acting. The Zero was a leaf. The Corsair was the wind. The heart of the Corsair's dominance was its engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It is one of the greatest engines ever built. It was an air-cooled radial engine. It had 18 cylinders. They were arranged in 2 rows of 9. It was a massive piece of machinery. In 1940, it produced 2,000 horsepower. Most other fighters had 1,000 horsepower. The R2800 was a quantum leap. But power wasn't its only virtue. It was incredibly rugged. Its cylinders were made of forged aluminum. It had steel liners. It could take battle damage that would kill other engines. Liquid-cooled engines are fragile. A single bullet in the radiator kills them. The coolant drains out. The engine seizes in minutes. The R2800 had no liquid coolant. It was cooled by air. Corsairs came home with cylinders blown off. They came home with oil spewing everywhere. They came home running on 17 cylinders. One pilot flew hundreds of miles with a piston rod sticking out of the cowling. This gave the pilots confidence. They knew their engine wouldn't quit. They could fly over the vast Pacific Ocean without fear. The engine was also designed for growth. Engineers added water injection. This boosted the power even further. By 1945, it could produce nearly 2,800 horsepower. The Zero's engine topped out at 1,100. It was a race between a scooter and a muscle car. The Japanese engineers couldn't keep up. They lacked the materials. They lacked the high-octane fuel. The R2800 was the embodiment of American power. It was complex. It was heavy. But it was unbreakable. It was the iron heart of the Whistling Death. By 1944, the air war was changing. The Americans were on the offensive. They were pushing up the Solomons. On February 14, the Japanese tried to push back. They launched a massive airstrike. It was aimed at the Allied beachhead on Bougainville. They sent bombers. They sent their best Zero pilots as escorts. They expected to catch the Americans sleeping. Instead, they flew into a trap. The Corsairs were waiting. The result was a slaughter. It became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. American pilots tore into the Japanese formation. They were flying the new F-1A. It had a bubble canopy for better vision. The difference in performance was stark. The Zeros tried to turn. But the Corsairs refused to play. They used their speed. They slashed through the Japanese formation. They fired short, deadly bursts. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber guns were devastating. They shredded the unarmored Japanese planes. Wings snapped off. Fuel tanks exploded. The sky rained burning aluminum. The Japanese lost heavily. Some reports say over 20 planes were shot down. The Americans lost almost nothing. It was the end of the Zero as a threat. The Japanese pilots returned to Rabaul shaken. They realized their aircraft was obsolete. It was too slow. It was too fragile. It couldn't dive to escape. While the Marines won on land, the Navy watched with envy. They realized they had made a mistake. They had rejected the Corsair. They had settled for the Hellcat. The Hellcat was good. But the Corsair was faster. The Navy needed that speed. The solution came from an unlikely source. The British. The Royal Navy received Corsairs under Lend-Lease. They didn't have the luxury of rejecting them. They needed every fighter they could get. So they figured out how to land it. British pilots developed a new approach. They didn't fly straight in. The long nose blocked the view. Instead, they flew a continuous curve. They banked left all the way to the deck. They could look out the side of the cockpit. They kept the landing signal officer in view. They straightened out at the last second. It required nerves of steel. But it worked. The British also modified the landing gear. They reduced the bounce. They raised the pilot's seat. The US Navy saw this. They swallowed their pride. They adopted the British technique. In late 1944, the Corsair returned to the US fleet. It arrived just in time. The war was changing again. The Japanese were running out of pilots. They turned to suicide tactics. The fleet needed a fast interceptor. They needed to stop the kamikazes. The Hellcat was good. But the Corsair was faster. The Ensign Eliminator had been tamed. It was no longer an outcast. It was the premier carrier fighter. It was ready for the final drive. The Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese Navy was gone. But the divine wind was blowing. The kamikaze. Hundreds of suicide planes were hurled at the American fleet. The defense depended on the big blue blanket. A screen of fighters patrolling over the ships. The Corsair was the star. Its speed was critical. A kamikaze started its run from high altitude. It dove at terminal velocity. To stop it, you needed a diver. The Corsair was a diving champion. Pilots would spot a kamikaze. They would drop their external tanks. They would push the throttle to war emergency power. Water injection kicked in. The engine boosted to nearly 2,800 horsepower. The Corsair screamed down. It shook with speed. The 20mm cannons tore the kamikaze apart. It was a gruesome task. The American pilots knew they were killing men who wanted to die. They weren't dogfighting. They were executing an interception. The Corsair's ruggedness was vital. Debris from exploding kamikazes hit the pursuers. Corsairs returned covered in oil and soot. One pilot ran out of ammo. He used his propeller to saw the tail off a Japanese plane. He landed safely. The whistling death became the guardian angel. It stood between the carriers and the suicide divers. The Japanese mocked the Corsair as clumsy. But in the skies over Okinawa, its weight was an asset. Its speed was a shield. It was the perfect interceptor for a desperate war. In the final months, the Corsair took on a new role. Mud fighter. The Marines on Okinawa were fighting a brutal battle. The Japanese were dug into caves. They needed close air support. The Corsair could carry a staggering load. 4,000 pounds of bombs, napalm, and Tiny Tim rockets. Massive 11.75-inch rockets. They hit like a destroyer shell. The Marines on the ground loved the Corsair. They called it the sweetheart of Okinawa. When they were pinned down, they called in the Corsairs. The planes came in low, scratching the belly on the ridges. They dropped napalm canisters. They tumbled end over end. They turned Japanese positions into infernos. The accuracy was incredible. Marines flew the planes. Marines were on the ground. They spoke the same language. The Corsair was no longer just a fighter. It was flying artillery. By the end of the war, the stats were in. The FVU flew 64,051 sorties. It shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft. Its loss rate was incredibly low. The final kill ratio was 11-1. For every Corsair lost, 11 Japanese planes died. It was total dominance. The plane the Japanese laughed at. The plane the Navy rejected. It had become the most capable fighter-bomber of the war. It won the air war. It helped win the ground war. The Corsair soldiered on. It fought in Korea. Its legacy is written in its silhouette. The bent wings. The long nose. The massive propeller. The Japanese admirals wanted a sword fight. The Corsair brought a gun. And it never missed.